Thank you very, very much, everyone, for joining us this evening. And on behalf of the chairperson and the trustees of the CSMVS and the Director General, Dr. Sabyasachi Mukherjee, and on behalf of all of us at the Museum Society, my executive committee and myself, Dinyar, a big thank you to you for acceding so readily to give yet another talk. I know you've been giving a lot of talks on this wonderful topic, and it's an inexhaustible topic, I may add. So thank you very, very much. We're looking forward to this evening. And I'm very, very happy that there are so many of us. I think there are some people who joined us from the UK as well. So Dinyar needs no introduction, but I think I need to say a few words about him. So if you will please indulge me. He is really a historian of modern India, focusing on Indian nationalism, the city of Bombay, Mumbai, and the Parsi Zoroastrian community. He is currently Assistant Professor of History at the S.P. Jain Institute of Management and a Research Fellow at the same institute in Mumbai. Prior to joining S.P. Jain, he was Assistant Professor of History at the University of South Carolina, where he received a Fulbright and a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowships. Patel earned his PhD in history from Harvard University in 2015 and his BA in international relations from Stanford University in 2004. Dinyar's first book, titled Naoroji, Pioneer of Indian Nationalism, was published by Harvard University Press and HarperCollins India in May 2020, right in the middle of the pandemic. Well done, Dinyar, to you and your publishers for making this possible. It must have been quite a feat for you. The book is a biography of Dadabhai Naoroji, whose dates are 1825 to 1917, India's first nationalist leader and the first Asian elected to the British Parliament. Aside from detailing the moderate pre-Gandhian phase of Indian nationalism, a period that has been significantly neglected by scholars, Patel's book demonstrates how Naoroji contributed to the growth of global anti-colonialism by putting Indian nationalism in touch with Irish nationalism, British and European socialism, American progressives, and African-American and West Indian political activists. He's also co-edited two other publications. One is From Ghalib's Delhi to Lutyens' New Delhi with Mushirul Hassan for the Oxford University Press in 2014, and Dadabhai Naoroji, The Selected Private Papers with S.R. Mehrotra, also with OUP in 2016. I know that he slogged away at the National Archives for many, many, many months. It was sheer perseverance, and I compliment you and congratulate you, Dinyar, on your struggle in Delhi as you tried to and succeeded in wading through the Naoroji papers. Dinyar has written for the New York Times Online, BBC News, The Atlantic Journal, Indian Express, Hindu, India Today, and contributes regularly to scroll.in. At the moment, he is researching and writing a book on Indian nationalism through the 1920s. The topic for this evening is an intriguing one, but when I approached Dinyar, I said, can you speak on Dadabhai's role in women's rights? And what was it that drove him to do this? Why was he such a groundbreaking person in the champion of female education, helping the pioneering work of networking girls' schools administered and financed by Indians rather than their colonial masters? These are some of the questions I'm sure Dinyar will be addressing us, and I do not wish to stand between the speaker and the audience. So thank you once again, Dinyar, for agreeing to this lecture. I know you have a very busy schedule, academic schedule yourself, and I really, really, on behalf of all of us here today, appreciate what you have agreed to do, and we're really looking forward to the lecture. So before anything else, may I request Jason and the technical team, and may I hand over the podium, so to speak, to you and to Dinyar. Thank you so much, Dinyar.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by thanking Dr. Firoza Godrej, thanking Mr. Jason Johns and everyone else at the Museum Society of Mumbai and CSMBS for giving me the opportunity to talk to you tonight. And of course, I look forward sometime in the near future where we can actually meet in person rather than speak over a platform like Zoom, hopefully sometime soon. So let me begin at least by talking a little bit about the nature of the topic that I'll be speaking on today. Now, whenever I teach a course on, say, Indian history or even modern history in general, when it comes to certain topics, it can be quite difficult to piece together stories. And that's certainly the case when it comes to women's history, specifically in India. And the reason is this: there are very few sources in relation to the amount of material and scope of the topics to discuss. Amongst the material that there is, a lot of it is either untranslated or is not accessible in the best way. So even though something like women's rights and social reform is such an important issue when it comes to modern Indian history, it is in many ways one of the most difficult things to work on and research. In our archival collections, we have very few collections of women. And on top of that, amongst the collections that do survive in India, majority being collections of men, there's very little reference. There are very few references to women in these collections. So it's a challenging endeavor. But with that in mind, let me go ahead and begin. So as Dr. Godrej mentioned, I'd recently published a book on Dadabhai Naoroji, a biography of the man who was known as the grand old man of Indian nationalism, someone who is commonly regarded as being the first Indian nationalist and also the first Asian to be elected to the British Parliament. And his life was long. He died when he was 91 years old, and his life story has many threads going through it. And today I'll only deal with one thread with regard to his activism on behalf of women's rights and women's education. So this is only one part of Naoroji's story, but it is intimately tied in with all the other strands that were part of his life: nationalism, economic activism, working on aspects of civil service reform, or in general the movement to promote a more liberal polity in India. So Dadabhai Naoroji is obviously commonly known for his political work, for his economic work, but amongst certain constituencies of Indian society, he was equally well known for his social reform activism. And this image that I show you over here kind of gives you a good flavor of how Naoroji was understood in different ways by different people. This is a page from a magazine called the Stribodh. It was a publication meant for the education of women, published in the late 19th and early 20th century. And you see in English, Naoroji is referred to as being the grand old man of India, but in Gujarati, he's referred to as being Stri Kalavne ne Sansar Sudarak na Mahan Yodha, the great champion or the great advocate of female education and social reform. And I think that difference in translation is significant because at least in the Parsi Gujarati reading public of that time, Naoroji was perhaps as well known for his activities of social reform and women's reform as he was for his political activities. And this extended to the larger Gujarati-speaking diaspora in Bombay and further afield in other parts of Western India. He was as well known for these aspects as he was for his political work. Now, let me begin with some influences on Naoroji that help us explain why he was involved in women's reform activities in the first place. Naoroji was born in 1825 in Bombay, in the neighborhood of Khadak, close by to today's Manvi or Bhindi Bazaar. His family was poor, and by the time that he was 4 or 5, his father had passed away. So his mother had an inordinately large influence over his life. And really, from the little material that we can tell about Naoroji's youth and early life, the one thing that really stands out is the influence that his mother had over really all aspects of his, political and social thinking at this time. So, even though his mother, whose name was Manikbai, We don't know much about her aside from the fact that she passed away around the year 1875, and she actually went to Great Britain with Naoroji sometime in the 1860s. So although we know that she was illiterate, she was very progressively minded. She was the person who decided to enroll Dadabhai Naoroji in school rather than put him into priestly training at a relatively young age. And she specifically chose a school for Naoroji where English was the medium of instruction, and teachers in the school were both English as well as Indian. And evidently, as we can tell from this autobiographical snippet that Naoroji wrote toward the ends of his life, he also got support from his mother in social reform activity. This is actually something that we see as a pattern amongst many other social reformers in India. I mean, whether it is Vidyasagar in Bengal or Bairamji Malbari here in Bombay, the mothers of these individuals played a very strong role in inculcating the social reform attitudes and activities of their sons. And it's no mistake that Naoroji's mother played a very dominant role in this particular aspect as well. So as I mentioned, Naoroji's mother enrolled her son in a school when Naoroji was probably about maybe 6 or 7 years old, where English was the mode of instruction. And this school was run by an association called the Bombay Native Education Society. And it was an early attempt at public education in an era where public education was relatively unheard of in India, as well as in other places like the United States and Great Britain. I mean, it was more advanced in those countries, but it was still in the nascent stages of development. So this was an experiment that was at the cutting edge of education, not just in India, but around the world. It provided free education to deserving students of all backgrounds, regardless of their economic standing or the language they spoke or where in society they really came from, with the probable caveat that people from the very lowest castes and Dalits were probably not part of this experiment, unfortunately. Nevertheless, Naoroji entered this particular school, and he apparently did very well during his time over there. He certainly excelled, was admitted into Elphinstone College when he was around 15 or 16 years of age, and received a scholarship to study there as well. So, from an early age, he understood the value of education, including free education, and education where people of different classes and backgrounds were able to mingle together regardless of, access to wealth or, certain privileges. Nevertheless, this education was entirely for boys. Okay, so the BNES did not cater to female students. And what we do know at this stage, and this is the beginning of something called Young Bombay, so we're talking about the 1840s right now, and I'll go into what Young Bombay means in the ensuing minutes. So, what we do know is that by the 1840s and 50s, very, very few women in India, especially Western India, were receiving any form of education whatsoever. Again, it's very hard to deduce what exactly education was like for women because there are so few sources, and the little information that we have is quite patchy. I mean, we have a few reports that were collected by the British government of, surveying what type of educational opportunities there were in places like Bombay or Nashik or Pune or Ahmedabad. And what we do know from reports from the 1840s and 1850s is that there were a few scattered incidents of, some, daughters of wealthy Hindus or Muslims or Parsis learning, the basics of education. But oftentimes this education would take place at home, very rarely would it take place in something like, say, a madrasa or something. And certainly women were not being admitted into regular schools run by Indians. There were a few missionary institutions that were started by people like John Wilson, where women were starting to be enrolled in schools as students, but very few. Okay, so we can talk, about a few dozen maximum, perhaps, a few hundred in all of Western India. But we do know from a few resources that some women were rebelling against the system, whether it was lack of education or lack of freedoms in other domains. To give you a very small example, in 1848, the precursor of the Times of India, what was known at the time as the Times and Journal of Commerce, published some correspondence regarding an incident that took place in 1847, where one Parsi woman who was living in Fort around the time of May 1847 was so sick of being stuck in a house in Parda And again, this is taking place in May. So you can imagine being in a very hot, confined house at the worst time of the year, really. She decided basically to go on strike. And so she left her house and went and camped on the farthest extremes of Bombay, which at that time was Malabar Hill, which was referred to as a jungle. And she camped out there. And this sent Bombay society, and especially the Bombay Parsi Panchayat, into quite a tizzy. What to do with this individual? And it was only after several days of coaxing and cajoling by members of the Panchayat that they were able to convince this woman to go back to her house and, end her protest. So what we do know from this very small instance, and, again, it's very patchy what we know of this instance, is that there certainly were women chafing at the restrictions that were placed on their life. And it was at this time that discussion about reform for aspects of Indian women's lives was, a common topic in newspapers and journals throughout India. I mean, it was being discussed quite a bit in Bengal in the aftermath of Rammohan Roy's political career. He talked to a certain degree about reforms for women, and it certainly was being talked about here in Bombay. It was being talked about in the Marathi press, Gujarati press, and of course the English language press as well. And it wasn't just people like Parsis participating in it. I mean, in this era, Parsis were as conservative and almost as backward as any other group in Western India. There was not necessarily a strong reformist streak, even though that changed very quickly from the 1850s onward. But there certainly was a strong conservative streak when it came to issues like social reform and women's rights that pervaded the community as much as it did any other community in Western India. So the one aspect that really interested Naoroji from an early age, and I'm talking here around the year 1848, 1849, when Naoroji is in his early 20s. He is finishing his school in schooling in Elphinstone College, and he's just beginning to get his first job, where he joins actually as a teacher and eventually as a professor at Elphinstone. He starts to think about this question of why women were not getting more education in Indian society. And it's around this time that other students and a few professors at Elphinstone were debating the same issue. And in the year 1848, a society that Naoroji helped establish, called the Students' Literary and Scientific Society, decided, look, well, there were some attempts by British missionaries or American missionaries to set up schools for women, or specifically girls, I should say, over here. Why don't we as Indians try to do this themselves? And so they did. In the year 1849 and 1850, they began to organize schools for girls in Bombay, and this began in a very small scale manner. So there were three groups of schools that were established. One that was Marathi medium, one that was Gujarati medium for Hindus, and one that was Gujarati medium for Parsis. And there were some professors and students who volunteered to teach at these schools. And basically, these teachers went around Bombay, knocked at people's doors, and tried to convince fathers, not the mothers, of course, tried to convince the fathers to let their young daughters go to school. And probably, 7 or 9 times out of 10, they got the door slammed on their face. Most Indian men would not countenance the idea of their daughters being educated, especially educated by strangers in schools. But enough enough girls at least were admitted into these schools for them to survive at pretty much a bare bones level through the early 1850s. Naoroji was one of the individuals involved in this effort. He helped run a girls' school that was established outside of fort. We don't know precisely where. His location was given as Baharkot, so we know that it was outside of the fort walls, but we don't know precisely where. And essentially, these students and professors like Naoroji would begin their day early in the morning. They would, go off to these small schools that were established, in impromptu schoolhouses, either in rooms of wealthy individuals who lent out their houses. People like Jagannath Shankarshet would lend out a room, or maybe a room in a public institution, or even one adjacent to, say, a temple, or even a gyari, for example, and they'd teach these girls for maybe 1 or 2 hours in the morning, and then they would begin their own lives as students and professors at Elphinstone and elsewhere. So they were receiving no pay. They were entirely self-funding their efforts. And on top of this, any help that they asked from the British, either the government or wealthy individuals in the British community, was quite few and far. It was quite limited. It was few and far between. The British government gave encouragement to this effort really only in a verbal form. They didn't really put their money where their mouth was, so to speak, and provide a great degree of funding. So this really was an Indian effort. I mean, certainly there were a few Britons and Irish professors supporting this, such as Professor Patel, who was a professor at Elphinstone College and a mentor of Naoroji. But by and large, this was by Indians, for Indians, and nothing more than that. In spite of all the incredible odds of this endeavor, it actually met with a certain degree of success. And by the mid-1850s, there were several hundred Indian girls on the rosters in these schools. And again, at this stage, it was catered towards three different audiences: Parsis, Hindu Gujaratis, or Marathi-speaking individuals. But eventually, there were schools that were started up for Muslims as well. And the really interesting dynamic about this is that as word spreads about the success of this endeavor, more people across Western India decide to help also. So wealthy individuals as far afield as places like Amitnagar or Belgaum or Ahmedabad decide to fund this effort and give money to this network of girls' schools in Bombay, and also began to set up their own girls' schools networks elsewhere in places like Gujarat and what we now call Maharashtra. So this was a remarkably successful endeavor in spite of a complete lack of robust financial resources. You did not have the British Indian government behind you. It was motivated by a group of men at this outset who might be, by our common, standards today, would be regarded as paternalist in the outlook, but nevertheless quite progressive in all other aspects. I mean, in this stage, it was impossible to have women as teachers because there were hardly any women in India to have a degree of education, to be empowered to be teachers. But these people were, progressive enough to realize that eventually that they would be able to train women to serve as teachers and replace them. And this is entirely what happened by the late 1850s and 1860s. The women who were enrolled in these schools, by the time that, they were in, their early teens or so, started to become tutors. There are some pretty incredible stories, about, one student who had a hearing impediment, who actually, became one of the brightest students in amongst these girls, and actually helped tutor other women. And there was a knockoff effect that was noticed also. The girls who enrolled in these schools went back home and taught their mothers or their aunts or their sisters how to read and write. So even though it was only a few hundred students, the broader audience which this educational endeavor reached was much larger. And as education of women became more acceptable in Western India, other aspects of women's social reform were developed and enhanced as well. So Dadabhai Naoroji was uniquely progressive in this manner. I mean, he was someone who believed in women's education, but he also believed in women's advancements in other spheres of life as well. Now, again, as I mentioned to you, one of the difficulties in Indian history is putting together any sort of archival record. Much of it has, been lost, turned to dust, or has, been otherwise, rendered unreadable. But we do know that, by 1882, relatively early in Naoroji's own career, he was making political pronouncements that, seem very close by to what we today would call, gender equality amongst men and women. So in an educational report that was given to the British government, he made a very strong case for the British government to support women's education, and he supported it by saying, eventually in Indian society, people would come to the belief that women should have all the same rights and privileges as men. And this was a revolutionary idea in India at the time, or even India today for that matter. But it was revolutionary anywhere else, as well. I mean, very few people in Great Britain were saying the same things, and those people who were saying that were at the utmost progressive vanguard of the British political establishment. I mean, gender rights and gender equality was an issue in places like the U.S., Great Britain, Germany, and elsewhere as well. So Naoroji really was a very advanced thinker when it came to gender rights and gender equality by any measure. And his activities in Bombay started to take on different forms. So today, if we think about the Parsi community, one of perhaps the most quintessential experiences, you can think of is, at Parsi lagans or weddings, you have everyone sit down in a line and everyone eats together, right? Men, women, children, etc. And what you have today is something that would not have existed 200 years ago or even 175 years ago. Amongst the Parsis, as well as amongst pretty much everyone else in India, if you sat down for a meal, it was gender segregated, right? The men would eat first, the women folk would serve, and only after the men were done eating would the women have permission to eat. And so Naoroji and his friends decided to introduce the relatively revolutionary concept at this time of what was called IntraDining. Men and women eating together at the same time. Now, I assume women were still given the bulk of responsibilities for cooking and cleaning, but at least they had a chance to eat together. And this activity slowly caught on, and it influenced other ideas, like the idea that a Parsi and a Hindu could eat together, or a Parsi and a Muslim could eat together, or a Hindu and a Muslim could eat together. So all of these broader issues that we see in Indian social reform were in many ways interconnected. And what happened in the Parsi community in terms of social reform would have a great impact on what was happening in other communities across India, and vice versa. So as women were given more opportunities in aspects of Hindu society or Muslim society, that also had an influence on what was going on in Parsi society in this era as well. It wasn't really just one community taking a vanguard, although the Parsis did enjoy a certain reputation by the late 1900s as being much more progressive than other communities in India. Not always, but often. So the other thing that I'll just end this part of my talk with is talking about how things like social reform for women were linked into much larger ideas and activities which people like Naoroji took part in. Within Young Bombay, and this whole reformist movement was called Young Bombay. It was a direct reference to something that took place in Europe starting in the 1840s and 50s, something called Young Italy, and eventually things like Young Germany, or even Young England. These were kind of reformist movements that brought new, mostly liberal ideas into the political mainstream. Young Bombay began with things like social reform. But eventually it moved into other aspects of reformist activity, things like religious reform and eventually political reform as well. So most of the individuals who were involved in things like women's education and women's rights were also working in other spheres. So, Naoroji and others like, say, Bhaudaji Lad or Navroji Fardunji all had, a role to play in the spread of education, but eventually they helped form things like the Bombay Association, which was the first real political association in Western India, which began advocating political reform that would enable Indians to enable Indians to take a much broader role in their own activities. So again, the idea of interlinkage is something I want to leave with you at the stage of India's development. So now let me broaden the picture a little bit. I mean, we've talked mostly about Bombay, and we've talked a lot about what was going on in the Parsi community and what Naoroji was doing to help reform in the community. We'll take a bit more of a macro level and look at how Naoroji played a role in wider social reform activities in India that reflected the status of women. Now, in the year 1855, Dadabhai Naoroji went for the first time to Great Britain. He went as a businessman working for the Kama family. And what we do know from his early years as a businessman is that he was not very good at business, actually. I mean, he was in some ways too scrupulous, or he trusted his friends too much with finances, and he encountered a lot of difficulties with business. But another reason why his business did not do too well is that oftentimes he was very distracted. He was much more interested in political activities or reformist activities rather than making money. And shortly after arriving in Great Britain, he lived in Liverpool for the first few years that he was in England, but he traveled extensively to places like London and Manchester. He became, acquainted with many of the leading reformist figures in British society. And in this era, the reformists were, they were a small circle of people, but they derived from a few groups. A lot of these people were individuals who had earlier been involved in things like abolition of slavery, or had been involved in things like the anti-corn law convention, which had protested protectionist aspects in terms of importing grain and other aspects, and were in favor of things like free trade. So these were people who were thinking about liberal rights for people, but also liberal rights in other spheres like economics, and eventually things like feminism as well. So one person which Naoroji met relatively early in his time in Great Britain was a woman called Mary Carpenter. And Carpenter was about 20 years older than Naoroji, and she came from a reformist family from Bristol. I mean, today, if you go to Bristol, if you go to the cathedral in Bristol, you'll see, I think, a plaque for Carpenter. And Carpenter's family knew Ramohan Roy, and Roy had actually stayed in Bristol, actually died in Bristol as well. And as a very young girl, Carpenter had met Roy, and this sparked an interest in Indian affairs and Indian social reform. Carpenter had a career in helping women in Great Britain and also educating homeless children, what were called ragged schools at the time, which essentially educated the street children in Great Britain. But sometime after Dadabhai Naoroji traveled to Great Britain, her interest began migrating once more towards Indian affairs. And I have a good belief that Naoroji played a definitive role in helping turning their attention towards India. So much so that in the year 1866, Carpenter actually went to Bombay and other parts of India in order to tour the country, specifically with education in mind. So when she went to Bombay in 1866, Naoroji, who was still in London at this time, wrote to his friends back in Bombay and said, look, this is an important individual in terms of reformist activity in Britain. Make sure that she gets a good idea of what's going on in India in terms of women's rights and women's education, as well as education broadly writ in India. And as a result, Indian allies, people like Naoroji Fardunji or Bavdaji Lad, were able to recruit Carpenter to be a supporter of expanded women's rights and expanded women's educational opportunities in India. Carpenter became a vocal supporter of establishing what was called normal schools. And these normal schools would train Indian women in how to be, the skills of being a teacher, so that, Indian men could step back and women themselves could teach girls. And this was important for an important reason. By the time that, say, girls were, reaching the age of 12 or 13, many of the fathers were getting reluctant to allow them to continue in school, since they were, reaching the age of what was at that time marriage. If you had women as instructors, it was far more likely that these girls would be allowed to proceed further in their educational opportunities. So Carpenter was one of the people who made this case and tried to get the British government to support more efforts to train women as teachers. And this met with a measure of success. There were one or two normal schools established in places like Ahmedabad and Bombay in the 1860s and the 1870s. Carpenter was also involved in a society called the National Indian Association, which was established in Britain, in Bristol, and also eventually had offices in London. And Naoroji, not surprisingly, was involved in this association from the very first day of its inception. And what it did was support social reform efforts for women from Britain. So, wealthy British people were tapped for funding schools, schools such as the Alexandra Native School in Fort in Bombay, and women were also, tapped to, talk about the importance of female education or social reform, and this association became an, important bridge for social reform activities between India and Great Britain. And it lasts all the way into the early 20th century, and it supported the activities of many people like Bairamji Malbari, Rakhmabai, another individual we'll talk about a little later in this talk as well. So while Naoroji was in Britain, he was working with British people on social reform activities, but he was also working with a number of Indians as well. This was an era where the telegraph had just recently been, established as a mode of communication between Britain and India. otherwise you were relying on mail, and mail would take, several weeks, if not, a month or two to go back and forth between Britain and India. In spite of all these hurdles, the difficulty of communication, Naoroji was able to establish, a transnational network in terms of furthering, a program of social reform and the advancement of women's rights. And he worked with three people in particular, who I'll talk about. I mean, there are many others, but three people in particular stand out. One was Bairamji Malbari, who many of you, recognize. He was an important social reformer and, as is less known, an important nationalist leader as well, who really was Naoroji's right-hand man in political activities from the 1880s through the early 1900s. And Malbari, like Naoroji, had a very influential, maternal influence growing up. His mother was involved in a lot of social outreach activities, and consequently, Malbari gets very involved in improving the stakes of women in Western India. So, if you look at the correspondence between Malbari and Naoroji in this era, women's rights and social reform dominate all throughout. Another individual, Ranade, who is much better known, was closely involved and tied into social reform activities in Bombay and Pune. He was someone who brought social reform into the domain of groups such as the Indian National Congress. And Ranade worked with people like Malbari and Naoroji also on legislation that was meant to help Indian women. The other individual is Bai Rakhmabai, or Rakhmabai Rawat. She's someone who, again, many of you know about, but quite an incredible individual. And it's a shame we do not know more about her. She was someone who had a child marriage, like pretty much everyone else in India, but by the time that she was a teenager, had the remarkable pluck and courage to refuse to cohabit with her husband, refuse to move in with her husband, and have a married life. She objected to the marriage, and she actually went to the courts. Although this court case dragged out for years and it caused a great degree of negative publicity and targeting amongst conservative Indians toward Rakhmabai, she eventually triumphed in a de facto manner. I mean, the courts did not go in her favor eventually, but she was able to get what amounted to a separation. And she became an important women's rights advocate who established her own transnational networks between India and Great Britain and further abroad as well. And she was someone who was well known in places like continental Europe and America at the time. And we do know that Rakhmabai and Naoroji knew one another and occasionally participated in the same activities for women's reform. And unfortunately, we don't know much more than that because not much material survives to document their working relationship. So, you do have, many of these individuals working with Naoroji in India, as well as a few Indians who came to Great Britain as well. But the other ingredient in these networks were women's activists in Britain who were focused on things like feminism and suffrage and suffrage, the right to vote in Great Britain itself. And one remarkable figure was a woman called Josephine Butler. Butler was someone who had been involved in things like women's education, the right to vote, feminism. She came from a progressive British family. She, like many feminists in this era, was interested in India, but didn't really know much about it. And originally had, maybe a more what we'd call an imperialist or colonialist attitude towards India. And Naoroji was one of the people who actually helped change Butler's attitudes and got her to kind of question some of these imperialist notions and think about India on its own terms. Now, in the 1880s, Butler was involved in something that was aimed at a group of laws called the Contagious Diseases Acts. And these were acts on the books in India as well as in places like Great Britain that were thought to be extremely harmful towards women. Now, in this era, venereal disease, especially venereal disease in the army, was a hot topic of concern. It threatened to immobilize large parts of the army in India as well as other parts of Europe, because essentially in this era, wherever you had an army camp, you had a large group of prostitutes or people who, tagged along with the army. And so what the Contagious Disease Acts were meant to do was to impose compulsory on-the-spot checks for these women in order to check for venereal diseases. And if any were found to have venereal diseases, they were kept far away from soldiers. So it was, these laws were meant to basically protect British soldiers against disease. But the upshot of this was that it was a terrible violation of rights of women, right? I mean, if any woman was suspected of being a prostitute or being associated with a British soldier, they could be checked for venereal diseases in a very invasive procedure, and this horrified progressive-minded reformers in Britain, India, and elsewhere. So Butler established an association that again had a transnational focus. I mean, it was headquartered in Britain, but it had offices in Switzerland, and people were working for it in America and Germany, as well as in India. And Naoroji was one of the people who was involved in the Indian aspect. And Naoroji, in turn, talked to people like Behramji Mulbari or others in India, or those who went back and forth, like Rakhmabai, in order to campaign against the Contagious Diseases Act. And we know from one letter that survives between Naoroji and Mulbari, which I've quoted to you on the screen over here, is that Naoroji thought that this particular act and repealing it was so important that all of the other activities for women's reform stood on the repeal of this act. What would be the worth of a woman if the entire standard of her life was judged on her possible role and relationship with the soldier? What is the importance of anything else we're doing if they're subjected to this humiliating treatment on the mere suspicion that they might be in a camp serving soldiers. So Naoroji actually worked with Butler, worked with many other members of this association. He actually traveled abroad to campaign for the repeal of these acts, not just in India, but elsewhere. And finally, in the year 1888, they were suspended. The acts were suspended, and this was to a certain degree due to the work of Naoroji and others, and it really helped solidify relations between British feminists and those Indians who were in favor of women's rights. And as importantly, it helped build a bridge towards political activities. A lot of these feminists in Britain started to get interested in the activities of things like the Indian National Congress. So when Dadabhai Naoroji would talk to people like Josephine Butler, he would increasingly talk about what the Congress was and eventually recruit her as a supporter. So you start to see a dynamic developing where a lot of these progressive individuals in Naoroji's circle, even though they might have nothing to do with India or Indian politics, start to support activities like the Indian National Congress. Now, I'll mention the Congress for another reason. I mean, there were certain limits to Naoroji's activities as well. In 1886, Naoroji served as the president of the Congress, and that year he put the Congress on a footing that was quite controversial. There were many in the Congress, like Mulbari or Ranade, who supported social reform being discussed within the Congress organization alongside political reform. And Naoroji actually said no. This was not a good activity, and that there should be a different organization for social reform, and the Congress should concentrate entirely on political reform. His rationale was that if we expanded the ambit of the Congress to include social reform, it could cause a lot of dissension and splits amongst conservative factions within the Congress. And in this case, he was actually right, because people like Tilak and others who were more conservative, socially minded, were dead against things like allowing women to participate in aspects of the Congress or other aspects of life in India. So it was a politically expedient and perhaps politically wise decision, but it definitely ticked off a lot of people in the Congress who were, staunch social reformers. So Behramji Mulbari resigned from the Congress after Naoroji instituted this plank in the Congress, and we know that people like Ranade were quite disappointed as well. So I want to give you a flavor of criticism of Naoroji as well as praise for him as well. And this enables us to move to the second to last aspect of this talk, which is what Naoroji was doing with feminism and women's rights in Britain as well as in other parts of the world as well. So through activities like the Indian National Congress, he was able to broadcast Indian rights not just political, but aspects of social reform as well, to a much larger audience. And as I said, he built up these coalitions between feminists and feminist organizations and organizations like the Congress, even though the Congress was not explicitly involved in social reform. By 1886, 1887 onward. Now, what we do know is that by associating with people like Josephine Butler and others, he was eventually brought into the network of suffragist and women's rights organizations in Great Britain. So here is something that I found in the Naoroji papers, basically a receipt for membership in something called the Women's Franchise League, which was one of the most important suffragist organizations in Victorian era Britain. So we know that Naoroji was communicating with some of the leading proponents of suffrage at this time. So important people like Emmeline Pankhurst. Pankhurst is so important that she was regarded as one of the most important Britons of the 20th century in a recent poll. She founded something called the WSPU, the Women's Social and Political Union, which was really the most important vehicle for suffrage in Great Britain in the early 20th century, and as importantly, adopted a militant tactic. So when we think about those suffragists in early 20th century Britain who were involved in, say, breaking shop windows or setting fire to things or committing arson, these were the people, and Naoroji knew them. And knew them very well, and would correspond with them, would go to meetings with them, and talk about India with them. These were the people who very famously, adopted the phrase "deeds, not words." They were going to campaign for actual rights and the votes for women rather than just keeping on talking about it. Another important feminist that Naoroji knew was Elizabeth Clark Wolstenholme Elmy, who established this other important vehicle for suffrage, the Women's Emancipation Union, and also was, in favor of eventually a militant strategy against men in Britain for the right of women to vote. So we know that Naoroji eventually, by the 1880s, adopted a position in favor of the right of women to vote in Britain. I could not find any evidence of him saying the same thing for, Indian women in India, but I assume his views were quite progressive also. And, for the next 15 or 20 years, he was in constant touch with associations that were involved in women's suffrage in Great Britain, things like the Women's Liberal Federation or the WSPU, and many of these letters survive. And he was asked to speak to these associations. He in turn asked for their support whenever he stood for Parliament. And when he actually was elected to the British Parliament as well, these groups reached out to him in order to support suffrage and further their proposal for getting the right for women to vote. Naoroji was also a very prominent member in a wider global circuit of people talking about women's suffrage. So we know in the year 1890, there was a major international conference that took place for the rights of women to vote. And this conference involved people like Mumbai. It involved many of the British suffragists that I talked about. And it also involved Naoroji, and it involved people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So you see in the lower image, Cady Stanton is included in the same line as Naoroji and Rakhmabai as a speaker. So, there's a chance that Naoroji shared the same stage and perhaps even talked to one of the, most important people when it came to getting the right to vote in the United States as well. So, this was an international conversation that was taking place. And it helped with Naoroji's own political ambitions and, again, his wider political activities in India. Some of the most important people who worked on behalf of Naoroji in his electoral campaigns were women. So even though women did not have the right to vote, they were the people who went door to door in central Finsbury, which was the part of London where Naoroji stood for election, and talked to voters. And we know from at least one of these women, a woman called Miney Bell, who was, again, a member of many progressive feminist organizations. Her husband was involved in progressive Indian politics. He was in the army in Madras, and he was also involved in progressive politics in Great Britain. We know at least from her testimony, the fact that women were going door to door and trying to convince people to vote for Naoroji made a bit of a difference. They were regarded, as you see from this quote, as being more kind and courteous and offering a different perspective than men on why people should vote for Naoroji and the Liberal Party rather than the Conservatives. Now, the last thing that kind of, broadens the global ambit that I'll talk about is a very interesting letter that I found in the Naoroji papers. And, the one interesting thing about the papers is that a good chunk of these papers are completely undocumented. I mean, no one has looked at the stuff since probably Dadabhai Naoroji did. And a good chunk of this material is either Gujarati or Hindustani or Urdu. I found some French in here also. And this was one of the Gujarati letters I found. It was terribly, terribly difficult to decipher. I actually gave it to someone in Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan who was helping me with some translations, and his head spun when we were trying to work on this because handwriting was quite terrible and the Parsi Gujarati is quite archaic. But eventually what we discovered is this was a letter written by a Parsi in Iran. It was dated Tehran in 1898. And it was written by a man called Ardeshir Reporter. Reporter was in charge of social reform activities for Iranian Zoroastrians. In this era, a lot of Parsis were worried about the fate of Iranian Zoroastrians who had been subjected to centuries of oppression and forced conversion. And so Reporter was one of the many Parsis who went to Iran, fomented efforts for education for Zoroastrians in Iran, and eventually he also took an interest in women's social reform. And he began talking to women, not just Zoroastrian women, but also women from Muslim backgrounds in Iran, and talking to them about social reform and education. And in this letter, he essentially asked Dadabhai Naoroji. We don't know if the two men actually knew one another, but Reporter definitely knew of Naoroji's reputation. He asked Naoroji to help him get in touch with leading feminists in Great Britain. People like Lady Fawcett, who was a prominent suffragist, in order to get their interest in the rights of the advancement of women in Iran, not just Zoroastrian but Muslims as well. So you again see how global these networks were that Naoroji was a part of when it came to women's rights. It wasn't just the rights of women in Britain or the rights of Indian women. It was also potentially the rights of Muslim women in a country as far away as Iran. So I'm going to end this talk by asking an important question. Did Naoroji practice what he preached? Oftentimes when it comes to Indian nationalists, the answer is no. We know that Gandhi was an extremely progressive figure when it came to many aspects of women's rights and the role that they could play in politics and larger life in India, but he was also a terrible father and a pretty terrible husband. He was not very good to his wife and children. With Dadabhai Naoroji, it's a bit of a mixed bag, I'll have to say. I mean, this is a picture of Naoroji with his family during retirement, probably around maybe 1907, 1908 or so. Now, I say it's a mixed bag for one important reason. We know hardly anything about his wife. Naoroji and his wife were married when they were extremely young. I mean, Naoroji was probably 10 or 11 years of age, and his wife, Gulbai Shroff, was 7. We don't know much about Gulbai at all because she hardly appears in any of the letters in the Naoroji papers. I mean, out of maybe 15 or 20,000 papers I looked through, a handful of references are there to Gulbai. She herself was probably illiterate. She, probably didn't know how to write or read. And it's strikingly odd that the wife of a person who had such prominent views on women's rights could herself be illiterate and so, absent from the archival record. There are potential reasons that are advanced. The first biography that was written on Dadabhai Naoroji by R.P. Masani suggests that Gulbai was just not interested in education. The marriage was not a terribly happy marriage. This might be the reason, it might not. I mean, we really don't know. But it certainly, raised a lot of questions in my mind about, whether Naoroji's own advanced views extended within his household. Now, we do know that they definitely did extend to some of his children and all of his grandchildren. Naoroji had 2 daughters, and one of his daughters became a doctor, Maki. She lived until around, I think, probably 1938, and she was, a doctor who I think settled in Karachi eventually. Amongst his grandchildren, some of the stories are quite incredible. Now, through Naoroji's son, Ardeshir, he had nine grandchildren, which is quite incredible. It shows you that contrary to what the situation is today, Parsis actually had children at one point in time and actually had a lot, as many as 9. Now, within that particular part of the Naoroji family, there were several firsts and several remarkable stories amongst the women in that family. So one was a woman called Naoroji, and Meher or Meherbai or Meherbanu, the different references to her name in the paper, potentially was the first woman to graduate as a doctor from Edinburgh University. So you see her seated on the ground, one of the two women seated on the ground at the very left. She's the leftmost woman over here. We don't know much else about her, aside from the fact that I believe she ended her career in Kutch with another sibling working as a doctor. Unfortunately, we don't know much else about her. We do know much more about Meher's sisters. For example, the Captain sisters. Many of you know about these individuals as well. Perrin Captain, Goshi Captain, Nargesh Captain. These were three sisters who married three siblings of the Captain family, and they became important supporters of Gandhi. They had a rather unusual transition towards eventually working with Gandhi. Perrin, for example, had her education in France. She attended the Sorbonne. Her sister Goshi went to Oxford. Both Goshi and Perrin were drawn into rather radical circles. They worked with people like Savarkar. Perrin was under the tutelage of Madame Kama. We know that Perrin learned how to make bombs. We have some documentary evidence that she was singing revolutionary songs in meetings in Paris. So she was part of a broader kind of militant revolutionary underworld, if you will, in Paris in the early 20th century. But when both Perrin and Goshi go back to India in around 1910, 1911, and eventually when they meet Gandhi, they become Gandhians, quite staunch Gandhians. They adopt nonviolence. They work in the non-cooperation movement, in the civil disobedience movement, and perhaps, aside from Perrin's quite, incredible stint during some moments during the civil disobedience movement, where she really kind of led the battalions against police officers and the army. The thing that they are best known for is their promotion of Khadi. I mean, still today, if you go to Nana Chowk, you'll see the Gandhi Seva Sena, where Khadi goods are on display and for sale. And this was an outfit that was started by Perrin Captain and a few other Gandhians. So if you look at, I had a chance to meet some of the people who work in this organization. If you look at the oldest papers, there are pictures like this. I mean, this is actually from the papers of the Gandhi Seva Sena, an image of Perrin Captain. I'll end with someone who, is in many ways the most remarkable amongst these siblings and the most, and the least known. A woman called Khurshid-Ben Naoroji. She is so unknown that we don't know when she died, even. There's no documentary record about when she died. She, like her sisters, grew up in a relatively wealthy, pampered, westernized environment. We know that by the time that Khurshid-Ben was, maybe a child or in her early teens, and the early 1910s, her family was living in Nepean Sea Road, which back then, as it is today, is one of the poshest parts of Bombay. And she, like her sisters, went to Europe. She eventually went to Paris, and she went to Paris to train as a classical singer. So here you have the story of a relatively upwardly mobile woman. She eventually finds her way to Athens, where she meets an American who actually married a Greek and helped revive aspects of Greek culture. It's a very interesting story, which I've traced out in an essay that will be published, I think, 1 or 2 months in a book that's coming out. And actually, it's in Greece where she became enamored with ideas of Indian nationalism. Strange enough as it is, there are many stories in Indian nationalism where people go abroad and only abroad do they discover their nationalist inclinations. And when she returns to India, she joins Gandhi. And specifically, she joins Gandhi as an advocate for things like Hindu-Muslim unity or the spread of ahimsa and the ideas of nonviolence in some of the most unusual places. She decides to champion nonviolence amongst Pashtuns, for example, specifically Pashtun dacoits in the NWFP. Places like Waziristan, Banu, Dera Ismail, places like that in the NWFP. And it's quite a remarkable story. I mean, in letters that she writes back to Gandhi in the late 1930s and early 1940s, she talks about spending days and weeks traveling between villages, sometimes alone, sometimes maybe with 1 or 2 other men. And, given that even today it is difficult for women to act independently in a place like the NWFP. You can only imagine what it was like back then. And she would actually go do things like wade into camps of dacoits and try to tell these dacoits about why kidnapping Hindus or why kidnapping others was a bad idea. And remarkably, even though we know that at certain points in times her life was in danger or that she was actually shot at, she achieved a degree of success. We know that at least from the letter she wrote to Gandhi, she said she convinced some people to give up dacoity. And apparently in the year 1940, her activities led to a decrease in dacoity and an increase in Hindu-Muslim unity in the NWFP. Unfortunately, thereafter, in 1940 and again in 1942, she was arrested. And that really ended her career in the NWFP. So I'll end with her as a good example of the broader legacy of Dadabhai Naoroji. I mean, this is someone who, did an audacious thing even by today's standards. And it's no mistake that she was the granddaughter of Dadabhai Naoroji. I mean, she was privy to certain opportunities and a certain kind of audacious political streak that she had in common with her grandfather. So if you have more interest in the book, I'll just mention you can go to my website. I have some resources over there, information on his family, information on the book. And in the remaining time that we have, I'd be more than happy to answer any particular questions that you may have. Thank you.